if there's going to be a woman president, I believe it's going to be through the only party that represents Black women and Black people significantly, and that's the Democratic Party.
Hey, TheGrio fam, it's Gerren Keith Gaynor, White House correspondent and managing editor of politics at TheGrio, and I'm here with Aimee Allison, the founder and president of She the People. Aimee, welcome to TheGrio. Pleasure to have you.
It's so great to be here. Thank you.
I want to talk about a topic that I feel is not discussed enough. Is Women's History Month. And despite the fact that many of America's peers around the world, from Germany and the UK to France, Canada, have elected women as leaders of their nations, America has never had a woman president. My first question to you is, why hasn't America elected a woman president by now?
Well, in order to answer that question, we have to understand the way that our current political system is set up. I mean, we exist as Black people in a system of white supremacy and as women in a system of patriarchy that's not just about personal feelings or personal interactions, but is about the way that institutions are set up. And those institutions determine who's in leadership. Back when I was in college, I worked on a Jesse Jackson campaign, and his second run for president, he famously said, you can try to change the leaders' beliefs and attitudes, or you can change the leaders themselves. And so much of the political system and building power, certainly for my work, women of color, is those who are most likely to change the leaders themselves. That means voting rights. That means empowering and educating and having a new set of donors who are willing to invest in women candidates. It means taking over leadership of political parties at the state and the national level to literally change the system to enable women to get that seat. That's that one seat that we have it. It isn't any surprise that the first woman vice president in this country is a woman of color, our Vice President Kamala Harris. And that's because women who look like me and Asian American and Latina and Indigenous women are the most likely to support women's leadership, particularly those who are advocates of advancing justice in this country at some level. And so it is a system that has kept us out of that seat, and it's the system that we have to change.
Mm-hmm. And charting the rocky pathway for women to the White House, we can look to history makers like Shirley Chisholm and even Hillary Clinton, who almost made it. Could you briefly talk about how they have brought us closer to that possibility, including our Vice President Kamala Harris and even other candidates like Elizabeth Warren?
I'm so glad you mentioned Shirley Chisholm, because let's think back for her historic run. She was the first woman to run as a Democrat in the modern era for president. And the reason why we need to credit her is because she dared to imagine a democracy where someone who looked like her, Black, a woman, child of immigrants, person who was dedicated and answering the call to public service, could assemble a multiracial voting coalition, embrace issues that ranged in, equality, gender justice, economic justice, racial justice, and advance. And she actually did demonstrate that she could assemble enough votes in order to have some delegates at that convention. And she inspired a whole generation, including Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who's now running for Senate in California. So I think we got to give credit to where credit's due, that Shirley Chisholm created and kind of inspired the imagination of a whole generation of people that said, look in our democracy that where white men have dominated every level of government, it doesn't have to be that way. In her footsteps and in the space that she created, politicians and leaders like Hillary Clinton came. Now here's the thing that we got to understand. In our current system, where there is two main parties, Democrat and Republican, the Democratic Party base is 25% Black. Black people are the force of the Democratic Party, and Black women are the majority there in terms of not only voters, but organizers, leaders, people engaging everyday people in issues, and who are holding that vision for the country of democracy and representation and inclusion. So understanding that, it's important to understand how the Democratic Party of 2016 and before did not recognize the unique power and influence and potential of Black women's leadership. And as a result, you have a Democratic Party that did not deeply invest in making sure to turn out the Black vote, uplifting organizers, or including our agenda in the issues, fighting voter suppression, and letting Black women in particular lead in terms of shaping the results of elections. That was power that we had to build outside of the party. So when you look at Hillary Clinton losing to a figure like Trump, representing the other major party who's dedicated to really making America white again, establishing, trying to make America throw back to a time in which, white people dominated every sector and system in our society, and really committing themselves to voter suppression and, trying to create an environment in which history is retold from the perspective of white people, that our history is not included. All of those culture wars and actual attempts to keep a white-controlled country and to prioritize white voters, all of those things create a stark relief. If there's going to be a woman president, I believe it's going to be through the only party that represents Black women and Black people significantly, and that's the Democratic Party. So when we look at that, to the extent that leaders and the whole ecosystem of politics embrace and include and uplift Black and brown women as the drivers of this new possibility, and they invest in that and they understand our value, that's when it becomes more and more possible for a woman to take that top seat. And, it's probably closer than we imagine, because right now we have Kamala Harris as vice president. We have Joe Biden, who's running for re-election. And that dynamic, things can change at any time. We already have a woman who's in the number 2 spot. So you never know what the future holds, but at least we can look at that and say, we have advanced and there's more possibilities ahead.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned Vice President Kamala Harris and possibilities. Could you, we've seen her on the world stage, even recently going to Europe and being the one on behalf of the U.S. Declaring that Russia had committed crimes against humanity in the Ukraine war. She's been utilized in the outreach to African nations and Caribbean nations. Could you elaborate a bit more about just how much the vice president has expanded and stretched that imagination for the country to see and visualize a woman in that position of power?
Well, Vice President Kamala Harris is demonstrating that she has the chops to lead on domestic policy as well as foreign policy, and can effectively speak on behalf of the interests of the US on the global stage. That's very important when you look at her positioning and her readiness to lead in the top spot. She often gets an unfair deal. I've read articles that try to criticize her time as vice president thus far. But as a person who's stayed closely, paid attention to politics from early on, during the Obama years, and watched the then Vice President Biden, Kamala Harris has a much more expansive upfront role on the global stage. And she's also taken the lead on some very key domestic issues. I'm thinking of the way that she has taken the lead in the post-Roe v. Wade era, after the Supreme Court overturned the right of an abortion, protected right of an abortion for women, where she has taken a policy lead, has signaled this is what the administration is defending, this is what we stand for, this freedom and this health care available to women. She's brought issues to the White House that would never have been discussed at that level, like Black maternal health, the crisis that Black moms face that puts moms and new moms at risk when going to hospital to have a baby. Like those issues are systemic issues, and she has brought attention to those kind of domestic issues. And I think in totality, across the domestic and global issues, she's demonstrated her ability to lead. I mean,
at TheGrio this month, rather than celebrating just Women's History Month, we are celebrating Black Women's History Month. And you, as your organization, She the People, specializes in Black women, women of color, leadership and organizing. And Black women have really been at the center of pretty much every political and social movement in America. How would the country benefit from being led by a Black woman?
I mean, immensely. Black women have only had access to our political system for fewer than 60 years. The passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which guaranteed and protected our right to vote. And we have not been able to rely on that right significantly in places in the South where the leaders were dedicated to suppressing Black women and Black men's political power. So that isn't even a guarantee right now. But in those 60 years, look at what we've done from the very birth of this country. And we're coming up on the 250th anniversary of signing the Declaration of Independence. Black women have held up the democratic faith. Phyllis Wheatley, going way back, she in Boston, at the same time that Thomas Jefferson was signing the Declaration of Independence, talked about freedom and liberation and the dedication and the possibility of a country that truly lived into the meaning of that. And that's the role that Black women have played through the generations. Since we've had access to the vote, we have followed that call for public service and have been breaking barriers. I can only imagine what it would be for a Black woman who carries the values, and this is very important, because most Black women, not all, but most Black women carry the democratic faith to today for the values of justice and equality, not only for Black people or Black women, but for everyone. And because we know and have suffered from the cruel policies and practices of this country over time, we are closest to potential solutions for that. We are willing to take risks. We are in order to solve those problems. And we are willing to reach out to people who have been ignored by both parties and assemble multiracial coalitions.
We are heading into a presidential election, 2024. Thus far, we've seen Nikki Haley, a woman of color, declaring her candidacy on the Republican side. Marianne Williamson, the former Democratic candidate in 2020, is soon to announce a bid as well. Do you expect there to be more women in the field? And regardless of how they perform in this cycle, does that help at all in the continuation of that imagination for the country and seeing a woman and imagining her as the commander-in-chief?
You know, I always say representation and a representational democracy in which everyone is seen in levels of government is necessary, but not, it's necessary, but not sufficient. That what we need are women who are going to advance a feminist agenda, advance a racial justice agenda, advance an economic equality agenda, because otherwise representation just stays what it is. It's someone who has a gender or a race that's not represented in halls of power, but that don't carry the commitments and the moral foundation in order to make change. So one of the things that we say is, you know, in our work with She the People, is that as we have worked across the country, certainly with the women we work with, a lot of battleground states, we hear the same thing. And this is women from the Central Valley in California, or in Dallas County, or in Georgia or Florida. They say the same thing, which is that it's not just women and women of color that want to be represented, although that is true. What we want are people who are going to champion the issues that are going to serve the people. And so you look at Nikki Haley, who is despite the the moment in 2015 that she reluctantly removed the Confederate flag from flying on top of this South Carolina state capitol after the white supremacists murdered members of a Black church. She had that one moment where she responded to what Black people were suffering in terms of this violence. But since then, she's been really mimicking MAGA talking points, denigrating Black people, denigrating immigrants, and committing herself to a kind of politics that would further entrench white power and white supremacy. That's not the kind of woman or woman of color that would bring change. So, what we hear is women of color are more savvy than that, and that we want a woman president. We want to imagine that, but we want one that is committed to, our future, building a new kind of America and helping us to make that real.